there were some questions from last week. One was your question that you asked what game engines were used by the military. The first one was named Unreal by Epic Games, and they've been producing these games from '98 until about 2007, but then they had the future one, but it was canceled. And if I want to show you some examples of how they look like, the 99 example, it's first-person shooter game. So you see that it's a simple environment. It's still good enough, but relative to whatever you see today, it's considered basic. But then they have the 2007 one, which is the last one, at least in this game series. It's more like whatever you play today. It's a bit fancier, it's smoother, and it has more detail, environmental detail. So it looks like basically most of the first-person shooter games that you see. And as you can see, it was for most consoles, at least in the 2007, but not the, well, they don't have Xbox, so, but they have 360. So yeah, that was one engine. The other one was Operation Flashpoint. And it was first introduced by one company and then owned by another. And they were also active from 2001 to 2011. And just to show you a quick example of how they look like, they look more like military training, in a sense that they didn't have that many fancy things, but their environment or interaction with other people were more realistic, in a sense that, for example, this is their earlier version, like 2001. You see, it's pretty much basic, but then I think they got better over time. So this one is from 2009. And this is their latest. So yeah, they were, I mean, you don't have to memorize these names for it will not be on the exam, but because one of your classmates asked what were the specific game engines, these two were two examples, but there are also others. Your textbook mentioned these two examples. And also there was another question about kinetic versus non-kinetic warfare or training or operations. It's because it is used in the context of military training very often. Kinetic is related to motion, movement, things like that. And so non-kinetic should mean something that is non-motion or not related to motion. But I mean, if you think about it, it's not really like motion versus non-motion. In the context of military, it is mostly anything that is not direct conflict or direct traditional warfare, in a sense of like shooting the enemy or bombing the enemy or anything of that kind, but is instead like indirect kind of war. But for example, like intelligence related or social related interactions are considered as non-kinetic, or radiation or biological warfare. that is not like direct confrontation, but then they realize that, oh, there was some, for example, radiation or biological weapon used in this region. Or psychological manipulations that even it existed from World War II by British forces, particularly. So if you think about these examples, they are particular examples of non-kinetic operations or training. And certain simulations were developed, just as we discussed last time, to train these non-kinetic skills. Do you have any question about both of these questions? So today, another thing that we want to talk about in the continuation of yesterday's discussion is what is called the SIMNET. And it's very famous by those who were engaged in the military training from early 80s to mid 90s. And it is considered as one of the first wide-scale, large-scale military training systems that are used. So one question can be like, because we talked about PC-based simulation last week, the question is, wasn't there anything more realistic or higher fidelity than a PC? Because PC-based simulation, it can be, as we said, it can be considered as high fidelity, but it doesn't have the actual touch and feel of the equipment. It's basically the interface is the same as your computer or PC. So this is a question because military is famous for using expensive high fidelity systems. Where are they? So SIMNET was basically the same as what comes to your mind as the high fidelity military simulation. They wanted to find a way to have the training in training environment, but not with actual devices, not with real devices. So this is basically a little bit older than whatever we discussed last week. This is before all of those PC-based simulation that we talked about. So because practicing with those actual equipment was dangerous, costly, they were looking for a way to be able to train, but also to be able to train in training stations, different stations that were far away from each other. So they were beginning to use more advanced equipment like Apache helicopters or M1 tanks that were both of them introduced in early 80s, late 70s. And so they wanted to find a way to train personnel on these more sophisticated equipment. Also, as another need, there were growing need for interactive training. And by interactive, it basically means that I can play and you can play the same simulation in a different place, and you can basically play the same game with me, not with computers. So it has this interactive component of several people interacting with each other in the training. So you can see that there can be, for example, 2 players, each of them having one persona in the game. So this SIMNET was developed by DARPA, a branch of Department of Defense, and it stands for Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. But in reality, it was more organized by DARPA. It was developed by 3 commercial companies. And those companies, you don't have to learn the name of those companies, but just to know, Delta, Perceptronics, and BBN for the name of those companies. And it was one important thing, or probably the most important thing about SIMNET, was that it used what was called in the time as wide area networking, or wide area network simulation, or what is known as WAN in the terminology of networking and internet. And what it means is that there could be different training stations or training environment, each located far away from each other, like in different states in the US, or one in US, another one in Europe. And they could be connected to play with each other in the real time. And in that time, there was no widespread use of internet. So this was a great achievement in terms of training. And it was used by the military in training much earlier than what we know as internet today. So to describe what the wide area network is, you see that these are like personal computers or PCs or stations or whatever you can think of. And they are connected with each other with LAN, local area network. And each of these groups are connected to other groups in the wide area network. Or in a different picture, you can see that these are stations or computers. You can think in terms of internet. And each of them have their local network, which are then connected to each other with like a cloud environment. So it looks like internet, but in that time, it was the discovery of, or the greatest achievement of this simulation, that they could connect other stations in far distance from each other in this way. So the development of this whole idea started in mid-80s, 84, 85, and it was first used in 87. So as you can see, although it was a big scale project, its development period was something like 3 years or so. And it was in service, it was successfully used and was in service until about mid-90s, 94 or 5. And also it was, as I said, composed of remote stations. And station is not necessarily just a single monitor or single interface, but it could be a number of interfaces connected to each other with local area network. At least each station needed at least one display so that they could interact with, or as their interface, interacting with the training environment. And it's important also to consider that these displays, they were embedded in a larger scale. Like it was not like something like PC. It was a display either mounted inside the interface of a tank, for example, or like you can just imagine the actual body simulation of a helicopter, and it was embedded in that system. It was not used with a mouse and keyboard or something like that. So the broader context of having these displays, it was more expensive simulators. it was something that touched or felt like the actual device. And as you can see, for example, the display were installed in such a tank simulation machine. And this is from late 80s. Or as another example, this is the simulator for Apache helicopter. And you can see that these displays are installed inside that. And both of these examples, they were using SIMNET. And so another important thing about it was that it could, or its server could support several hundred users at once. And they used a technique that we don't want to go through the detail of the technique, that they could basically have the computational resources to process that graphical processing in like a local or in their servers, in a local server in the US, by using some state-of-the-art graphical techniques, so that it allowed them to have several hundred users at once. And this feature of interactivity, so that people could play with each other, was highly used, or made it suitable, made this whole SIMNET more suitable to practicing scenarios and tactical missions, or any other kind of like group rehearsals of any mission. Because people could coordinate with one another and play in group. And the closest US military conflict or engagement that came after that, which was called Operation Desert Storm at the time, 1991-2, or in a broader context, the Gulf War, what is known as the Gulf War. It was used for that conflict particularly. And just to give you a quick information of what the Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm was about, it was Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and then after fighting Iran for 8 years, they invaded Kuwait and took an entire Kuwait, which is a tiny country in the Middle East. And then because they had huge oil fields and everything, and then US forces went there to free Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. And they did that in a relatively short period of time. So they were using in that time such simulators to train fighting in that area. Do you have any question about SIMNET and whatever we discussed until now? So SIMNET was a successful project, and one can argue that it also influenced game industry because it came earlier than many of the modern games that we know. Just to give you an example of how it influenced the game industry, especially if you think about this idea of playing in network. Because if you think about like older consoles like Sega or Atari or any older consoles, you couldn't play with other stations. And this was their idea first time. So the developers of this, one of the three companies that were involved in the development of SIMNET, founded a different company that was particularly used for that networking working on or developing that networking property. And then company Sony bought that company just to develop this idea of working with network or playing with network in the development of their PlayStation or PS2 online networking. So this is just an example, but you can see how military helped development of gaming industry. And so SIMNET itself, if you think about it, it was not just a project like that was started and finished by a certain time. It also inspired their later development of similar projects in different branches of US armed forces. And one, for example, as just one example of how they influenced other trainers, Air Force later developed something similar to SIMNET, which is famous, and it's called a distributed mission trainer. And again, the idea was the same, it distributed over a large area or distant areas of each using one training station. And it looked something like this, that different units could connect to each other through this system, and they could have independently different modalities of connecting to this server. It could be live, it could be using like live military equipment, and they could at the same time be connected to the same server or same network as those that were using virtual simulators or high-fidelity training simulators with the same network. And they could practice different scenarios. And this, as you can see, allows them to change their training or change the scenarios of their training the way they want. If a particular area needs using actual equipment, they could connect to the same network as those that need lower fidelity or just PC-based simulators, for example. And as you can see, it's more or less similar to the same idea of SIMNET that we talked about. Or Army used a similar training system or program. And it was called Close Combat Tactical Trainers. And that was also a similar idea to what Air Force used. And for example, this is one of their stations that you can see is using high-fidelity systems, but the player is connected to other players in the same wide area scenario. And this is another example of, I think it's a tank training interface in the same system. And as you can see, different units are like one person is playing this, another one here, and they are using different types of devices to play with each other or to practice that mission that they're practicing. So what you have to keep in mind, and is important, is that if this SIMNET used WAN, wide area networking, and each unit of network was one of these, what is known as a station. And a station can be either one person or a couple of people working together. And each station used, as the examples that we saw, probably the highest level of fidelity that they could use at the time. A combination of actual devices and displays. One important thing is that although what we talked about these stations, unlike what we talked about last week, that it's PC, you can go anywhere, basically, that you can connect to the network with internet. This one used, because of those actual devices that they were using, it was not like you can go anywhere or even walk when you're in the same training environment. It was basically in stationary, fixed training environments, because these displays were mounted on certain devices, and those devices were like in training environments, certain training environment. You can think of tank or helicopter simulators, for example. And again, it was successful. It showed a high level of transfer. It was probably the first major success of training in that scale. And it used, or they found a high transfer rate from this training environment to the target environment in those Operation Desert Storm or similar conflicts that we talked about. And most of this performance criteria that we are talking about, it was tactical training or coordination, how teams acted during a mission, and their behaviors and those kinds of in group or social or interpersonal relationships. So they successfully implemented the training without using the actual target environment devices. So one question is that, what do you think, especially if you compare this SIMNET with whatever we talked about last week as PC-based simulator, what problems do you think SIMNET had?
I still think that SIMNET would be able to mimic like the emotional factors experiences of the real target environment. So, for example, if you're getting shot at or engaging in combat in the simulator, you're not going to feel nearly as frightened or afraid if you were going through that same thing in the target environment.
Okay. And your name?
Alex.
Alex. Okay, so yes, it is still training stations. You know you're in a training station, and it's difficult to replicate or reproduce the same emotional triggers or emotional factors that people experience during an actual military engagement. Yes.
I'm Chris Moreno, and even though it was probably a lot cheaper to make these simulations, they probably didn't have like a ton of them sitting around. So if I were to guess, it probably would have been hard to try and train a lot of people. They probably could train like 100 people.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the important shortcomings of SIMNET, that they used these stations that were fixed and used almost realistic devices. And it was basically one person at a time or three people at a time, or if you think about that entire WAN, 40 people at a time at most. So you couldn't have like a larger scale unit training at the same time, or with the whatever that they could personally use in their time, like thousands of people. You couldn't have that, basically. And we saw the limitation of that network.
Unemployed clinch, they have no way of simulating anything. So it's like the pretty much only doing vehicles, right? So it's like you kind of missing out some stuff there too, right?
Yes, most of their focus was on using these helicopter, tank, and those kinds of things. And anything other than this entire military personnel that they could do. I mean, if you think about the real military conflict, they need personnel doing a lot of different things, not just using tanks or helicopter or any of like hard devices, but there are also a lot of other people engaged. And they don't get the benefit of this training with SIMNET, for example. That's another good point.
Those stated previously that different devices, like input devices, can interact with each other at the same time, like with it in force. What if that pose the question that some inputs could be inherently more advantageous compared to others?
Yes, so you can basically say it was not like not everyone connected to that network had similar type or comparable experience because their stations could be different. Yes, that's another criticism that we can have on this SIMNET, and just like those small picture that we saw, people could use basically one person can connect to that same network with a very high fidelity or realistic system, another one with not similar system. So yes, that's another problem. Any other? Especially if you think about the reason that we are having the training program, saving costs. Do you have any idea about that aspect? So if you really think about SIMNET, you mentioned some of its problems, but the first one I would say is because it was very expensive. Because if you think about developing each of these stations compared to PC-like or PC-based simulators, they used extremely high fidelity simulators or actual devices to some extent. We saw that people were in tank simulator or Apache simulator. They are expensive devices, not like just another computer. And again, this is comparing this with PC-based simulators. It's very expensive. Also, it was difficult to, like, if you had a fixed number of units or stations, then to add another station was difficult and expensive because you had to build another station and connect to the network. And in that time, connecting to a wide area network itself was a more difficult project that we can think of today. So it's, in terms of expandability, it was a bit difficult. And just as your classmate mentioned, it was just used by only a subset of personnel. And many other involved, like medical or those involved in anything other than these, using these sophisticated devices, were basically couldn't get the benefit of training. So these were some examples of the shortcoming of SIMNET, in addition to what you mentioned. And because of these shortcomings, they started thinking about building PC-like simulators that were much cheaper, expandable, and scalable. And they could easily add roles, different roles, not just those that use tanks and helicopters and similar equipment. So these problems made them think about building PC-based simulators that we talked about last week. I would say that they still exist, that kind of expensive stations of training, but only for particular reasons. And for example, flight simulators, they are still the same kind of expensive training stations. But if you think about expensive military training devices, what comes to your mind as those that have the feeling and touch of the real equipment? It's basically one of the descendants of the same SIMNET that we talked here. So do you have any question about these aspects of using SIMNET and problems?
So would you say that the military is generally going to more or less stick with these PC-based simulators, or is there still potential for these, the idea of this wide area network stations to be innovative and potentially?
So as far as I know, they use this, I mean, they retain that idea of wide area network. That's one of the things that hasn't changed since SIMNET until now. But in terms of thinking about cost and reducing the cost, they've always been thinking about how we can reduce the cost of training. That's why they shifted from those expensive devices like SIMNET to PC-based simulators, at least for those roles that didn't need that much high-fidelity simulators. And even if you think about computer-based simulators or PC-based simulators or video games, they're even within that context thinking about how we can produce less expensive video games or simulators. So they're always thinking about how to cut these costs. And just as an example that I have been engaged with in my research, one question was how we can, because building like more realistic simulators is more expensive, even within computer or video game environment and simulation. The question was how to balance the effectiveness of training or transfer and the cost by finding the optimum level of fidelity. So if fidelity is too high, it's too expensive. If it's too low, it doesn't help training. What point we should find the fidelity level to be for specific tasks or for certain tasks like maintenance and troubleshooting. So yes, what remained with at least US military training is how to save costs because training is expensive, and how to save time, and at the same time retaining an acceptable level of transfer and training effectiveness. Any other questions? Okay, if we think about expensive training stations that we just reviewed here, we can, I mean, first, last week we talked about PC-based, which is more recent, then SIMNET and similar that came before that. And now we can go even before SIMNET and see what came before SIMNET as the earlier systems. And if we go to the end of this spectrum, which is early flight simulators, it goes back in history, 1910. It seems a little bit odd thinking about simulators or training systems or simulators in 1910. But a few years after Wright brothers, they were thinking about how to train pilots to use airplanes. And they used basically very simple systems or simple devices that they had to build these simulators. Things like the most simple technology tools that they had at the time. And as you can see, it looks like very old airplanes, but they were used just for training. Particularly, I think the earliest company that produced these training systems was a French company, a company in France, and they developed these systems. But the most well-known or the best known example of flight simulators or early flight simulators is what is called Link or Link Trainer, which was introduced in 1927, early years of the growth in airplane industry, and airplanes were more used in, especially in wars of the time, and they needed to train pilots. So Link Trainer, because it's very famous, that's why I'm focusing on this one here. It was produced by a guy named Edwin Link. That's why it's called Link Trainer in Binghamton in New York. This is Edwin Link. And they started a project in 1920s, and they could build something like a product or training product that could be basically sent to other places from New York to everywhere else in the US or even other countries. And it was widely used before and during World War II and even to the 50s. But it's most famous for extensive usage was during World War II. So if you want to see how it looks like, during World War II, British forces used Link Trainer. And as you can see, it's a bit difficult to, but here is a small, like airplane-like simulator that the pilot is sitting here. And like this airplane is surrounded with like physical mock-up of the environment, like clouds and things like that. They didn't have computational simulator at the time, so they had these wallpapers mounted in front of the pilot. And you can see that the radio communication is controlled by another person. And also, there's another photo of Link simulator in the US in 1943 in Indiana. And they tried to build these simulators to look and feel like pretty much like the actual airplanes of that time. And this is one you can find it in probably most military museums and in DC, in Dallas, Texas, in different places that they have military and Air Force museums, they have an example of Link simulators because they were very famous and used in wide scale. And of course, its earlier versions were much simpler, like those used in 30s, much simpler than those used in 50s, the beginning of Cold War. So these Link trainers were basically, if you think about flight simulators or full flight simulator today, Link was probably the father of all of these simulators. or predecessor of all of these flight simulators. And if you think about a modern flight simulator like this one from Boeing 737, this is a very expensive, sophisticated system that is used. But if you think about the concept and the original, like, it basically looks like the same link trainer that we saw, but is a much more sophisticated system. And it can replicate the feeling of all of the gravity, speed, acceleration, and all of that.